that's fascinating. I am
Well, if we just plan in the future to have less figures in the budget, we can cut out the discussion. Not in the budget.
Have everything you need.
This is like 2 years old.
Oh, really? Yesterday, I think we were at one time I got 27.
Yeah, I'm aware. It's
smoke that down to San Francisco.
Well, not going in.
She just moved across the road. Her husband
There's a guy.
before he died.
That's when to get
Yeah, maybe she
Well, Crawford. You are science I'm organized a meeting and it's full up of bread. And it makes it's so right because that he was already that crap like so much. As it became later
I've had papers starting to for things that I'm like literally not doing. Take a picture of your car and say,
Oh yeah. I know. We all continue without the yeah, I know the I'm not sure I like it. But I know that in Rome, an article about it. I'm not sure if I saw it. I remember that I tried it. I remember if I
They bought a house right just half a mile from where it existed. Oh, and they bought it for
I offered to play. There are quite interesting guys. Well, for some of 50 and 100, you go with and you get it. If they are, what is it? There are some that from my wife now, and one understand. Do you want to be controlling that? Doesn't bother at all. The meetings are very I don't remember. I'm not sure.
the neighborhood I grew up in.
Are you aware?
When I see them now, we had the oil there.
Yeah, right.
Bringing the berry. Even though I couldn't get up
That reason it doesn't go on exploring
Oh, I'm sure. We had a lot of family during quite a while. Yeah, I see.
He went to different conferences, you know, doing networks. I Oh, yeah, that's the reason. Yeah, yeah. Keep going from his son and Simon. Oh, yeah. So, I keep going to the message. All things that allow share.
Well, I can go out. Month of the year, the discussion.
What begins at group and
I'm glad to see him there. Do anything else? Nope, but I think, you know how they say, I'm gonna hold off June for a while.
It's warmer at 10 o'clock than now. What are you doing tonight? At 10.
Thank you. Sure, no problem. Don't have to be
I know that I'm not going to my coat. I will get my Gore-Tex.
Well, you can have the climax statement here tonight. You get to wrap it all up and tell us.
I'm very impressed with
You get to wrap it all up and get everything right.
Yeah. Very difficult. To be the last.
Maybe impossible.
It's complex.
Yeah. Which is, you can say, is there a spontaneous order that's emerged from us? Well, maybe not.
No, that's a gift. That's not a gift.
Okay, yeah, but
but I have to retire with work that. But that skill somewhat in the environment.
so many
Picture and the name of your granddaughter. You are the best, and you are nicer.
Picture would be nice.
Bah oui. Without a name, it's okay. Can you send me a picture of your name? And you sign it. Grandpa. Pas d'habitude. Suddenly you had that.
But there's only
I think the other thing is, we're all behind it down.
especially if they're can't keep up with the inflation.
I think I will.
Well,
You saw also.
Marty did a couple more.
Don't send the SMS right now. I don't think they are sleeping.
I did. I also. Yeah. But I saw it in college, interesting to see all the ways
Ellen and I talked to 11. So, talk to Ellen.
Yeah, but I know for those who
Last night at dinner, and that was so wonderful. But that's not the only thing.
What's going on now? Welcome to No Name.
I know she's here. They're all it was originally, I was told, just well, after
They come up. I guess they did, but we should make sure tonight that maybe they have moved anything.
We need to reconvene, please.
So we begin?
Kind of set up over here, ready to roll. I've actually done that before with somebody else. I'm retired now, so I don't have the.
What? Yeah? But
I'm all ready to go.
No. That's different than saying, I think you have to defend
Okay, we're ready to get started.
That's why you look at the foot.
Let me get you to take your chairs, please. Let me make a couple of announcements. It's perfectly sensible to go over and get coffee or something else to eat during the presentation if you do it quiet. Okay? The other announcement is that there's a list coming around. We probably should have sent this around earlier, but the Polanyi Society has an electronic list. Whenever we host an issue of tradition discovery, we send out a table of contents with links. We don't try to fill up your email box with mail about things, but we have calls for papers for conferences. There's one coming up in June. Please sign the list, and we'll put you on the electronic list. And when the Polanyi Society does something else, at least in this area, for sure you'll get some kind of notice. Any other announcements?
Can I just say that I am not going to make a whole nother pot of coffee. So when that coffee runs out, it's gone. And if you're desperate, we can find another place for you to get coffee, but I just wanted to warn you.
Okay, our first presentation is by Nina Raikuntha, and she's all ready to roll.
Hello, everyone. I'm from Singapore, an assistant professor there at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. And my interest in Polanyi really began sort of as an afterthought, because I work on the digital economy. I particularly look at the future of work. I'm very much interested in Ulrich Beck's idea of the risk society, Anthony Giddens as well, and the whole idea of what we're conceiving as a newer kind of risk society, what I believe is now turning more into a flux society. And I talk about this in my upcoming book. So when I read Polanyi, it wasn't an easy read for me. And I'll be very honest, because A, I'm not trained as an economist, and B, because he kept saying that he's made it Keynesian economics simpler, and I was trying to find the simplicity, but I couldn't. But I think.
Have you read general theory?
Yeah, but I think his tacit knowledge was a bit easier for me, actually. But having said that, there were some things that resonated with me very well when I started looking at it, and that was the idea of the money belt, and money was all that mattered. And I was thinking, okay, how does this sync with some of the questions and debates that we're having today about the digital economy and how it's going to affect employment in just about all areas? I mean, there is this question about, how far can computers, robots, algorithms replace our jobs? And I don't think we have a fixed answer, and I don't think a fixed answer is going to come, because nobody knows. I think that's very clear. And the other part is, because I'm from Singapore, and it's a small country that is very, very committed to this idea of a digital economy and a smart nation, and making sure that public spending is very pragmatic, and then they allow innovation, but at the same time, there is a lot of social ideas of social inclusion, and also about managing sort of expectations in society. So this is what really got me interested in this whole talk, and this idea that yes, the state should promote free trade. There is a lot of backlash on that, as we know. Many countries don't want to do that anymore. We know that from Brexit. We know that from other examples. But Singapore, of course, is all out to promote free trade, because that's how we survive. We don't grow anything on the island. We don't really have manufacturing. So free trade is basically what we do. And as far as full employment is concerned, Polanyi, of course, argues that it is possible if you inject investments and money into the money belt. But I'm thinking, in the digital economy, do we have full employment? Is that possible? Is that a myth? Or are we moving towards more what we consider transitional employment? And I'm thinking of the fantastic talks that we heard earlier, especially from the students and all of you. We're talking about things like Uber and computerization and so on. And I believe that all the jobs that are sort of coming into being, I mean, there is no sense of permanence anymore. And I think we all will agree on that permanence is not what organizations or corporations actually want. They basically want innovation. And how does innovation work? Innovation works by, them basically feeling that they can let go of certain things and add on new things at any given point in time. So this idea of contingency of labor. And of course, injecting money into the system, that's something Polanyi also talks about. In Singapore, at least, it's all about, keep spending, keep the retail economy going, at the same time, invest heavily in science, technology, and I would add societal programs, because they're very big into ideas of national integration. So, scientific research, of course, Polanyi argues that, it should not be subject to planned or, centralized control of the economy. But there is a new idea, maybe it's not so new, of the proactive nation state that I've been studying, and I've written about this extensively in my book, whereby the state tries to become this very pragmatic arbiter of entrepreneurship, of business, just to keep the economy going and to put new investments into what they believe is going to contribute to the digital economy. The Smart Nation initiative in Singapore is one such example, where young entrepreneurs are given lots and lots of money, and they're thrown into various kinds of competitions, so that they can become the best disruptor, or the next big disruptor out there. So disruption seems to have become the norm. Don't be disrupted, instead create the disruption that you want to be. So that's the motto here. So with this idea, it's like I'm thinking, okay, what are some of the debates I'm looking at in the digital economy? Technology, will definitely affect the production and circulation of money. And later on, I'm going to talk about the whole idea of bitcoins and what Bitcoin technology might or may not do in terms of the money belt that Polanyi conceptualized. And technological determinism, I've been looking at this, from ideas of, Thorsten Veblen to Marx himself. And if you look at a lot of the debates coming out of corporations, and here I'm not looking so much at academic debate, but rather study all the rhetoric coming out of companies. I can clearly see the theme that technology is going to drive the way to progress, and somehow technological progress is defined as economic and social progress. But how is this conceptualized? And clearly, what I see is the link between that and focus on innovation, focus on disruption, and of course the increasing dependence on the algorithm economy, where a lot of things are either in the process of becoming smart or will become smart. So this idea that digital everything is better, and to some extent, I myself see the inevitability of this because of the way things are going, the way corporations are driving a lot of the change that we're in. But at the same time, of course, I do of course worry about what's going to be the human side of this. Where are we heading? And what role are we going to have in this? So I lean a lot towards Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens' idea of the risk society. And here, of course, they're talking about environmental risk and all other kinds of risks that we face. But all the more, I believe that we're moving towards something I call as the flux society in my book, where, in a sense, that people are made to feel constantly uneasy about status quo. That status quo is not something that we appreciate anymore. It's this sense of impermanence, this sense of I'm not doing enough, or I'm not creating enough, and I'm not being this innovative person that my society or my company or whatever, so in a sense, who is this innovative self? And that's kind of linked very much to a progressive society. So the role of the proactive nation state. Now, how did I start thinking about this? I mean, there is literature from the World Bank and OECD, they talk about proactive policy quite a bit. But then I was starting to imagine this idea of the proactive nation state when I started seeing a lot of debates on television in Singapore, whereby members of the public, academia, business people, are constantly invited into talk shows. And this is very common. And I've been on a couple of these televised talk shows where people talk about the impact of technology on everything, on things like money, on, kindergarten education to everything. And then, of course, there's a debate. But the debate, of course, is leaning towards how can we engage the citizens in adapting this technology. And, of course, there's a huge focus on encouraging collaboration and upskilling of the population. So we have something known as a Skills Future program, which is given to pretty much every citizen, permanent resident in the country, and people are given money to take courses. But of course the drive is towards that if you don't upskill yourself, you're going to be out of this, So you have to believe in free trade. Full employment may or may not be possible, but at least you're going to be employed somewhere, because you need to be employed somewhere. And Singapore has a very low taxation system. I think the top taxes you ever pay is maybe 15%, but it's way lower than 15% for most people. And the idea is, yes, let's keep money circulating in the system. Interest rates in banks are very low because you save money, but not at the cost of, actually not spending on retail or not investing, in things. So you can see that this idea about, let's bridge the digital divide, let's keep investment going, let's keep talk about employment going, is very, very big in this situation. And then, okay, I just want to mention something that Anne said about the system that requires trust, which I found very interesting. Because the average Singaporean, I'm not speaking about everybody, there seems to be enormous trust in the government. And, like other economists or political economists may have plenty of other things to say, but this is what I've noticed, that they place their faith in it because they believe that the system acts, A, proactively, and B, it's very pragmatic. In terms of the economy seems to drive a lot of the decisions that the state makes. But now there is this sense of humanism that's crept in, like, yes, we're going to make sure that this is a highly technologized society. But at the same time, we're trying to creep in this idea of the caring society. So a lot of this is coming into social innovation, social entrepreneurship, X, Y, and Z. But it's also a very reputation active society where, because I think it's partly the survival, of being a small nation. How do you become globally competitive? So I'm going to switch this because this is what my paper was attempting to do. But of course, I'm looking forward to lots of comments and discussion, is this link between that idea and something very different, i.e. cryptocurrencies. Okay? So I got very interested in Bitcoins because some of my students are heavy investors in this. And I have a couple of student millionaires who've made a lot of money on this. And I'm like, what is this? Is this a boon or bane, right? So as I teach a digital sociology class, we got very, interested in this debate. And because I started seeing okay, some countries temporarily ban it, then they put it on again. Actually, it's hard to ban this. How do you ban this? At the same time, some other people are having a lot of angst as to, if you ban this, it's still going to happen anyway. So you might as well, adapt it and then become, so, if you're looking at investment banks, for example, JP Morgan, the CEO said it was a fraud, right? But you have Goldman Sachs saying, no, we need to make sure that we're actually part of this economy. China bans it, and then again, they're trying to open it up. In Singapore, we have a Bitcoin ATM. As well, you can draw money, or you can actually cash in Bitcoins. It's the idea that, yes, if we don't harness this, somehow it's going to overtake us and it'll be too late. So rather than be posthumously or like a reactive state, let's try and be proactive and try to take in every innovation that comes in. So talking about Bitcoins, okay, what are they? I really struggle to sort of understand this initially. Do they work like regular currency? Is this the money belt that Polanyi was actually talking about? Is something I'm thinking about. I don't know the answer. My paper tries to explore that, and I'm looking forward to speaking with people trying to improve that idea. Actually, it started by this very elusive Japanese inventor who everybody says is hidden. Nobody knows who he is. But of course, he has a name. We don't know if that name is real or not. And now, I mean, it's caught on. People are supposed to have become millionaires. How does this work? Okay, it's computing. It's a lot of, blockchains, because blockchains basically keep a register of who has bought and sold Bitcoin. So it's supposed to be very honest in that sense. You can track its history. You know who's transacted it. But come on, is it vulnerable to cyber attacks? No, because it's kept in a digital wallet. So you can crack. Somebody can hack that, and it's very possible to do that. Now, there's of course on the one hand this idea that this will increase the flow of money because more and more people can get into this without the intermediary of banking. So you don't have to pay the high transaction fees, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, people are worried about crime, because it's going to go into criminal hands and XYZ, and maybe there's going to be like the dot-com burst, and one day this is going to disappear. We don't know that, right? Is this going to be the next big disruption and kick out all the banks, out of existence? Or is this going to be a complete failure? So my question here is really, should governments regulate cryptocurrencies and the algorithm? To what extent? And can they regulate it? Probably not. I don't think so, because so much of this is about the democratization of access of money markets to people. But I strongly believe that perhaps this is putting a lot of power into people who do high-end coding. Now, I don't mean just any kind of computer coding, but people who drive the algorithm economy, who can put algorithms into very sophisticated use. Are they going to control the circulation of money then? Then what happens? You see? I mean, did Polanyi actually, want that? I mean, we all said earlier that he didn't want a completely liberal economy. He wanted some level of regulation to keep it going, but at the same time, he did not want like a Soviet kind of state. So what should we do? I think a lot of the world is now thinking about this. Should we just adapt cryptocurrencies? Some people are arguing, of course, the central bank should control this and have a digital currency, but we should control this. This is going to be very, very problematic. Is this the disruption of money? So if so, how is this going to affect full employment? These are questions for me to think about. I don't think I have the answers yet. And how is this going to affect trade? Because I think, in effect, what this kind of thing does is just gets rid of the middlemen, gets rid of, to some extent, bureaucracy, to some extent, big intermediaries that, of course, control everything that we do. But, of course, with this, you will also see loss of jobs. If this were to become mainstream, we're not going to be able to avoid this. So, do we co-adapt this? Do we let this go? It's something that, I just wanted to think about. So the issue here is we don't really have an international standard or policy that works for all countries. That's going to be impossible. We don't even agree on what trade policies should look like or what globalization should look like anymore, because countries are becoming more protectionist. I mean, you see a lot of that happening. And I think, as I study policy, I find that there seems to be a time lag between policy and innovation. Policy doesn't seem to catch up with innovation as fast as it should, because it's innovation's going so fast that I think it's even hard by the time and governments catch up. And are we all being too reactive rather than proactive? I mean, something that I'm looking at. And is economic flux, shaped by firms and their labor policies? And firms are very powerful, in a sense that when I've spoken to a lot of firms about employment, in my own research, I mean, to them, labor is just labor. It's a number. It's not a person anymore. And it's all about how can this employee actually serve my interests, as opposed to, how can I actually find them like a lifetime position, So you can see that the debates are changing. And of course, what I want to say lastly is that disruption is highly unpredictable. So, having said that, yes, I mean, I think Polanyi's ideas to some level express a utopia. I think they are relevant today. But at the same time, how are we going to sort of explain all of this disruption? Because when we don't even understand. So, I'm leaving you all with a question: is full employment and free trade even possible, given all these different things that that we're seeing and that we're witnessing? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're running a little bit behind, but does anyone want to add other questions or provide any answers, Marty?
Well, a little bit about maybe, and well, 3 main points, if I may. I totally agree with this time lag between innovation and policy, although it is true that we are having increasing amount of regulation on this topic. It's been very celebrated, what we call the Dow case or Dow ruling here in the United States, which is like Dow are the letters for decentralized autonomous organization, which is what there is, because there is not a visible leader. Doesn't mean that you don't have to follow the US regulation. And in particular, it declares that these organizations are issuing securities, therefore they have to follow the securities law and will be enforced. After the US has regulated this, China has responded. So more recently, China has regulated this framework as well. And China was one of the focus points, because now the bitcoins are crafted in China, because it's the only place, well, one of the few places in the world where electricity is subsidized. Otherwise, it doesn't pay any more because of the computational requirements. Okay. Point number 2 about the JP Morgan saying that's a fraud.
Yeah.
Some people claim that might be, vested interests are there. That because say that okay, these cryptocurrencies are providing an alternative for funding of startups and etc. etc. So this, what they call ICOs, initial currency offerings, these new currencies are capturing the market that JP Morgan may have had before. And point number 3, your question of whether is this another .com bubble of the year 2000-2001. For instance, I dare to give an opinion because I'm also writing about this topic. And I'd say more or less yes. Maybe not the Bitcoin, because the Bitcoin is very well calculated, so there cannot be inflation forever. There's just a certain point where you would stop produce. So the production of Bitcoins will happen like the opposite of an exponential thing, like a logarithmic function. But with other cryptocurrencies, I'm sure there is a bubble. Absolutely sure. There are many cryptocurrencies that are things like, where the number of solar spots or things like that. And that's pure speculation. Yeah, so I think some of the currencies will be kind of serious, and this would be Bitcoin and Ethereum probably. And many of the rest, maybe not, might be a bubble.
Thank you. Are you still working on getting yours set up, or?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's do one more question. Let's do one more.
I had 2 questions. So one of them relates to Keynes and thinking about sort of full employment. One of the things that Keynes sort of brings up is firms' decisions to invest, and sort of he thinks in terms of he's also employed to sort of think about the maybe irrationality of firms have to somehow believe that there's a sort of long-term future in order for them to invest sort of material resources and things like that. And so, do you see like the present moment as a lot of firms hoarding cash, of course, technology firms in particular?
Hoarding cash?
That being connected to sort of like their particular vision of the future. And then the second question was about currency, and I think that maybe some of this hinges for me on sort of what we think of as a currency, philosophically, what money is, and sociologically. And so this question is, the state is so central to the possibility of money, and things. Money doesn't exist in the state, for me anyway. And at some level, Bitcoin sort of depends on this interface with an existing sort of state-backed currency or something like that.
Right.
And so the absence of that, I mean, I don't see Bitcoin as having any value possible because of this lost infrastructure that it depends on. And so maybe just you could say more about how you think about that.
Sure. I'm just going to come here. So, firstly, with my interviews with a lot of tech companies that I spoke to, firstly, what I noticed was extreme amounts of anxiety as far as what the future was bringing, because they don't know what their competitors are up to. So there is that issue, and there is this issue with, largely to do with, the millennial population that's working for these firms, because they believe that most millennials are going to walk out the door, they're going to get paid in their jobs, so they need to be constantly on the front, bringing people. But of course, I've walked into like dozens of recruitment firms, and of course they promise you that you can have a long-term future here, right? But is that true or not? Is something that I'm still investigating. Like, is it company-driven or is it individual-driven? Because companies are saying it's more individual-driven. It's not about us. And yes, I mean, finding cash for innovation, it's almost like they have to, or they lay people off. Like IBM, recently laid a lot of engineers off. I think globally they did that, and firms do this all the time because they're trying to say, okay, we need to be competitive, we need to be innovative, and competitive means innovative, and because we need to recapture our market share or create a new one. So there's this angst and back and forth, going on as far as companies are concerned. As far as cryptocurrencies are concerned, the way I understand it, it is, of course, it's very interesting because it's very coding mathematical driven, right? So you have to have a lot of trust to even invest in it. Yes, the reason it's popular right now is because it's not backed up by a large bureaucracy. There are groups of people who do not want governments to get involved in it. It's their own thing, right? Like if I'm very good at blockchains, and I'm whatever, I can be a user or a miner. I can define my space and then I can do that. But what governments want to do is now they're saying, fine, here's a digital currency. We want our central banks to get involved because if you don't have the state involved in money, then money can go into anybody's hands and something terrible could happen with it. So I think there is this, but again, I see a lot of back and forth with cryptocurrencies. People ban it and then they open it up again, and it's sort of like, should I stop this? Should I not stop this? Or should I get into the game with the rest of them? So I think we'll have to see with what happens. I mean, and I agree with Marta that some of them will exist, some of them will die out. But from what I understand from my student investors in this thing who are like so big time into this, that it's completely built on trust and who they know right now.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt you. We must go on. Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion. Hopefully we'll continue. Getting Eduardo?
Yeah. All right, I'm an engineer, so I will address this through the point of view of an engineer. And also a bit of point of view of career of Michael Polanyi. Here we are in 1933 when Polanyi arrives in England, and Manchester Guardian says on the first page, Cristiano Ronaldo has arrived to University of Manchester. You mean the best chemistry in the world enters the University of Manchester. A few years later, less than 15 years later, Polanyi resigns from his chair in physical chemistry. And something that always puzzled me, not so much now, he got a chair in social science. And this is, in terms of career, such a so strange thing. A club contracts Ronaldo to play football, that then says, I want to play tennis, and you pay me. So, if we know how universities work, this is not so simple. But really, what I see in Polanyi life is not a tragedy, but a lot of drama, and a permanent drift as his personal interest, reflecting on his very successful initial career as scientist. Well, I argue that Polanyi began, even in Berlin, to think that scientific method is exactly what we need in the social and political environment, which, by the way, was not very different from the fundamentals of communism. Manage society by scientific, well-proved methods. And we know that in Berlin, Polanyi organized a group of friends, a group of some that later were some of the most important people in the 20th century, and began discussing how to use science to solve social issues. And science for him was not purely empirical, we know that well, is a social consensus, but experimentation was the trade he was used. So I argued that he began his interest on experimenting to understand the social and political things, especially economics. Polanyi had no background in economics. He had a background in chemistry and advanced chemistry from atomic theory, kinetic theory, that's very much mathematically dense. So he had a kind of experimental background, doing things, experimental, and thinking about theoretical, mathematical-based models. And that's the way he begins thinking about economics. And he begins with something that is not very much, we don't know very much. But we know that Polanyi began doing analog simulation. By the way, in the 40s, when I began my career, I still knew about analog computers. I'm sure my son never saw one and doesn't realize what that is. But the next big thing, I remember when I began my career, and first computers, 74, 75, were appearing, in engineering, especially in chemical engineering, for control of big petrochemicals, for instance. The next big thing would be what was called hybrid computing, using digital computers with analog embedded systems that would sort out what digitals were bad to do, especially differential equations. So, for me, analog computing, that tells me a lot in my personal career. And analog computing has been very important in science. So my first point is to say that Polanyi made substantial contribution to analog computing. And in analog computing, we don't have digital computers. We all use physical systems to emulate other realities. Something like a proxy of reality, a proxy of economics, through something like an hydraulic system. And we know, and the biography of Molesky says that in it, and Scott, and there are some additional information, especially in Scott tapes, but there are no documents at all, unless that, about what Polanyi did. But some of his students report that he forgot about his chemistry things. He called the blower, by the way, the blower is something very in chemistry. The glass blower that was able to make complex shapes in glass for complex apparatus. So he used his best blower and put in the table in his office and began constructing a hydraulic model for macroeconomics. If you read general theory of kinds, you don't find there equations, only one picture, one figure, one graph. It's largely qualitative, and that was not his language. The language he was used in science, in chemical kinetics, in adsorption, in metal X-ray. X-ray crystallography is very dense mathematical. So it was not his language. So it was trying to visualize that using analog computers. He never published anything. But if what Scott tells in the biography and others report happened, then we must say that Polanyi should have an important place in the history of analog computing in economics. Basically, he was the first to make it as a system, not only as price versus demand, but as a dynamic system flowing in time. I don't agree that what Gabor suggested, that Polanyi was very much influenced by the game of that guy, I can't remember the name. I have the game. It's a kind of monopoly game to train children to use money. That, by the way, is a companion book. Or Mooney. Mooney tried to create hydraulic systems. Mooney was vice president of General Motors, by the way. The guy that created the international operation of General Motors in Europe. But he spent a lot of time and wrote a book about capitalism based on his liquid flow analog computers. We know that Polanyi tried something absolutely on the border of simulation. The digital analyzer. That digital analyzer is one of the milestones of MIT around in the 30s, beginning of 40s. The digital analyzer basically is a solver of systems of linear equations using electromechanics and electronics. So it's a very primitive kind of machine, not really a digital computer, but was very much used for planning of networks of utilities, for instance, and further things. And then what happens that people in the atomic energy, atomic physics, and in Manchester had the machine of that. And we know Polanyi tried to use it to simulate it, never published anything. By the way, one of the head of that physical department is very famous for his contribution also on using digital analyzers. So what we have here in the first years of Manchester is Polanyi not only working with his students on physical chemistry, but also beginning playing games with analog computers. And his main conclusion is, I don't go there. It's not easy. He has not been successful. Unfortunately, we don't know really why. But I can imagine. I argue that it's at that point that he realized that I need something completely different. A completely different kind of analyzer, of simulator. Because the analog computing was interesting, but could not do the job that you wanted. He basically was thinking about trade theory. Trade theory is slumps and booms. How does slumps and booms happen in the economy? And that was quite different, quite difficult to achieve. So that's the reason he began the movie, as an alternative non-analog simulator for economics. And this is a breakthrough in visualization. There is nothing comparable in visualization technologies compared to this film. He found a completely new way to visualize economics. Circular diagrams would be very popular, and every book of macroeconomics, Samuelson began with that, every book of macroeconomics is circular diagram. But this only begins end of 60s, not in the 30s, when Polanyi began to do the film, and basically 38 and then 41. Really, I strongly believe that we need to rewrite some chapters of the economy, the history of economic thinking, especially about visualization. Polanyi definitely is a very advanced visualization process in the history of economics, 20 years before some of those things began to appear. And what is the main point of that? Abstraction. What you see in the movie, if you already saw the movie, is a complex abstract diagrams animated. It begins with auto-neurons, it's very clear. But that in 10 minutes is gone. Cannot continue to use it. He spends a lot of time to show how his auto-neurons based diagram changes to a pure abstract circular. And then he goes step by step to more complex engineering diagrams. Well, I'm chemical engineering. That's the typical diagrams of chemical engineering, with bypasses, reflux, all the kind of tricks we use in chemical engineering. And he makes the movie as a computer-generated film, we would say today. But he had no computer. And he had no terminal, no visual terminal. The screen of the movie anticipates future terminals of computers. But the technology of visualization is exactly the same technology you can find today in macroeconomics simulators. Exactly the same kind of language. Okay, you put more dials and less dials, but it's more or less that. And you use it for two things. For field experimentation, the 150 people that saw the movie, but especially the hundreds of students of WEA, Workers Education Association, that, by the way, produced a very good report about the movie and used the movie and the limitations of technology, too ambitious. Anyway, he learned on the field about and learned the limits of technology by field work of this simulator, training and educating people. But he learned another way, as mental experimentation. By the way, in physics and history of philosophy, it's very usual. Let's make an experimental, a pure abstract experiment. That's what he did. Thinking about his model was experimenting with the effect, an educated experimentation, mental. So the movie was a tool of simulation that continues his efforts of analog simulation, but entering in a field that is neither analog, neither the future digital things, using the technology of animation in movies. Walt Disney. That is the moment. And so he creates another point to put stress in history of economics. He makes the first movie about macroeconomics and the first trial to use a movie to train economists on macroeconomics. Even introduces the distance learning concept. Even he argues in the Senate of the university, and we found the minutes, that the university should invest creating distance learning films for distance learning activities. 1945, maybe 47, something like that. So this is my first point. We need to review some of these aspects to give Polanyi a much fair place in some aspects of the history of economics by someone that was using his knowledge of experimentation and mental framework from a completely different area. By the way, I don't believe what Gabor showed as the first sketch of the model. Because that is exactly the last model of the film. So it doesn't make sense to say that there you have the architecture of the final model you see in the movie. All the flows are there. For me, I knew that drawing, and for me the intriguing thing is not the diagram, it's the integral. So he was trying to calculate analytically by a calculus that integral. My guess is that was trying to create the amount of money generated by the system and the entering in the trade cycle, in the circulation. But that's a guess. But I don't believe that to be in the beginning. That should have been later. Has it been written in a paper of letter in the 30s? Well, that doesn't prove anything. It could have been written much later and doesn't make sense. By the way, I can show you his original, we know already, his original drawings. Yeah, we already saw it today. This is the, he says, this picture was first designed to illustrate another presentation, but he says in another place, this is his first circular model for the movie. What that diagram on the envelope is more or less this. Is this, more or less. With more details, more complex than this. And this only appeared in the second version of the film, in 41. It doesn't appear in the first version Polanyi made in 38, and that showed in the Statistical Society in Manchester. So that's the reason I don't think that to be the case. Really, we know, for instance, what was the original drawings and what appeared in the final movie. I collect that information, and we can see how the visual process went from the original design, the sketches, until the final version of the movie. And so here I think we have really nice material about visualization and design, graphical design. Yeah. Yeah. My next point is about Russia. I would argue, and I posted something related to that, that a third lecture Polanyi did in 1937 is the third foundational lecture. I already wrote about the first and second, the popular education and the visualization of economics, and I strongly argue this is the third one. And these three fully complete the agenda of Polanyi for next years. This paper about Russia is quite interesting. It's unpublished. A transcription is available in my website. And he gave this lecture for the 20th anniversary of Russian Revolution. By the way, we are now celebrating last month, the 100th. So it's amazing to reread that, and I strongly suggest you do it, because it is terrible actual. 80 years later, his analysis of Russian Revolution, I'm not a specialist, but I would guess still maintain most of his actualities. And here Polanyi is again on the scientific method to understand the world. Of course, understanding Russia was a challenge, understanding communist USSR. And then they argued that he used all his skills of statistics, of data collection, to make the first system analysis of Soviet economy. Simultaneously, at exactly the same time, two other English guys were doing a tremendous work on national accounts in economics. Colin Clark, an incredible guy that later went to Australia, and the Nobel Prize. No, not Kuznets. It's in my. That Polanyi repeatedly uses materials in full employment. Richard Stone. Richard Stone, that is usually considered to be the father of modern national accounting. And the analysis based on statistics. And once more, let's use the scientific method to understand the communism. Is system analysis of of Russia, easier, was so good that later Colin Clark published the book and arrived exactly at the same conclusions. Well, some small difference on the numbers, but nothing very different. Yeah, I'm closing. Yeah.
Quickly close, please.
Yeah, quickly close. Well, I bypass another part, I go for the final. I remember, in my abstract, I remember another economist, Lerner, that is very popular in America. As a Keynesian economist, wrote a book exactly with the same conclusions of Polanyi, full employment and free trade. Just print more money. And the surprise of surprises, for me at least, Martin Wolf published a few years ago. Martin Wolf is the well-known British economist that writes in the Financial Times. And Martin Wolf wrote a very important book about the European crisis and the world crisis. And these main conclusions, a lot of conclusions, but one of them is there's only one way to do it. Central European banking prints more money. Period. This is exactly the central thesis of Polanyi. So the dialogue, the theme of this book is on top of the table. Austerity is, the book of Polanyi is basically about austerity. Trade cycle, what you do on a slump. So that continues to be top of discussion in the table of the economists. To finally close, Phil, my final argument is that during his life we see a drift of Polanyi from the epistemic side, the epistemological side of things, to more and more to the hermeneutic side. And I would argue to finally that Heidegger has been more important for him than usually is realized. There's a lot of notes in the manuscript of the 60s written by Polanyi about Heidegger.
Okay, thank you. While this is setting up, just quick comments.
Okay, one question, well, not question, just a comment. I would like to link this Polanyi's idea of the circular diagrams to another scientist of the time, who was Phillips.
Oh, I forgot Phillips. Phillips. I forgot Phillips.
Okay.
My argument is Phillips learned the idea from Polanyi. Through whom? Through X, through Meath, and Meath oriented the doctoral work and all the work of Phillips in the machine.
Did they know each other, you think?
No.
No, they don't. Phillips don't knew him. He was in the war. He was prisoner of war in Birmania, I guess. But yes, Meath, James Meath, Robbins, Robinson, X, they were all friends of Polanyi. X was in Manchester. Don't forget when Polanyi was doing these trials of analog simulators. So, if you check that, it's very clear. And in my slides, you can see a document in the archives written by Polanyi that clearly shows that he had, at least in his mind, exactly the Phillips machine.
Thank you. You tell me when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay, we're going to go on with Agnes. We do have a little time for a general discussion at the end. We may carry over 5-10 minutes, but we're basically moving toward the conclusion. So, please, Agnes.
Thank you. So, first I'd like to thank Anne and Eduardo for inviting me. So I'm glad to be here and not by video conference, as it is still written on the program, I think. And I'm an economist. I'm Agnès Vestre, and coming from the University of Nice in France. So my talk is about Michael Polanyi's economics, but of course I will also talk about their overall contribution, not only economics. But the first idea of the paper was to investigate how is it possible to reconstruct Polanyi's economics, given two major influence on his work. That is, on one side, Keynes, since this conference is focusing on full employment and free trade, and second, Hayek, who also had a major influence on his work, his view of economics. So, we'll focus first on the Keynesian influence on Polanyi, then on Hayek, and then we'll see how is it possible to reconcile these two opposite visions, because at first sight we can think that Keynes and Hayek are not possible to reconcile if we have in mind the debate in the 30s concerning the explanation of the 29 crisis and the way to cope with this crisis. They had really opposite views. So we have some possible explanation. Of course, it's ongoing work, so I don't have any definite explanation for that, but it seems that we can understand that from the point of view of Polanyi, there is some coherence between in having these two influences in his work. So these are two quotations just to illustrate the fact that Polanyi was really impressed by the work of these two economists. So for Polanyi, Keynes' general theory was a great achievement, and he was sure that it would have a very big impact on the history of economic thought. And concerning Hayek, when he wrote his essay, his 1969 essay on the determinant of social action, so he refers and he gives a due tribute to Hayek's work, especially on his vision of self-organization and what Polanyi will call polycentricity. So first, Polanyi as a Keynesian. So if we concentrate a bit on Polanyi's free employment and free trade, so Polanyi gives a contribution which is a monetary theory of production, as exactly as Keynes stated. So that is a kind of economics which has to be distinguished from a real exchange economy where money is neutral or conceived as a real, and so in this sense, free employment and free trade is a monetary theory of production which focuses on the fact that saving and investment are really independent decisions made by individual agents, and that they are monetary aggregates. And this is the reason why, this is the cause of possible fluctuations, of cyclical fluctuation, and of course, of massive unemployment. So this book is also a manifesto for budget deficits in order to reach full circulation, which has to be defined, but it gives some clue to define it. And this has to be made basically by the emission of new money, so printed money, and not by means of interest-bearing government securities such as loans. So we made clear that this creation of money that has not to be conceived as loans, but really emission of new money. So these are the. I don't think we saw them today. So we saw a lot of graphical representation. So this is the way Polanyi represents the money circle with what he calls the money belt, and he describes the effect of injection of new money as an enlargement of this money belt. So as you can see, moving from full employment to inflation. So this is not a good case, but you see that the money belt is enlarged. And on the contrary, during depression, so you have a shrinking of this money belt. So then, Polanyi describes, gives this principle of neutrality, which is not very clear to me, I must say, but because it doesn't, it's big strange for economists, because we think about neutrality of money, so we are a bit confused with this principle. So I don't really know how to interpret it, but it seems to be that the emission of new money should not disturb, should not be an hindrance to transaction that has to be conducted on their own merits, as you say, in a way which requires no materially significant economic or social action to accompany it, or any sacrifice on the part of a part of the population. So it is also an illustration of I think a clear separation between what is a full employment state policy and other matters like social reforms. So there is this ambition to make a clear separation between economics and politics. We already talked about that. So it seems that he wants to give us a kind of mechanical, technical representation, which is freed from moral considerations, which is a bit strange because he also develops a moral economics, but just to make things clearer, he wants to do this analytical separation at least. So of course I'm not talking here about the rest of Polanyi's economics, and also concerning the Keynesian influence I didn't talk about free trade, which is also another aspect, and especially is commonalities with Keynes and Polanyi commonalities concerning the emergence of the IMF, for instance. So I just skip this part of the Keynesian Polanyi economics. And then I move to Hayek. So there are many connections between Hayek and Polanyi, as a lot of specialists here know. There is, for instance, Phil wrote about that. So they first met in Paris in 1938. Polanyi revived reviewed several books of Hayek. He also read a lot of Austrian economics. We also had the opportunity to hear that today. And then, so for instance, Polanyi reviewed Hayek's Counter-Revolution of Science, also Individualism and Economic Order. When he published his 1941 essay, The Growth of Society, The Growth of Thought in Society, he published it in Economica under Hayek's editorship at the LSE, so there are a lot of connection between them. He also participated to the first meeting of the Société Montpellerin, founded by Hayek and others. So it's not a surprise, comes as no surprise that there is a lot of influence of Hayek and Polanyi's work, but not only economics. So for instance, so I just point some commonalities. So of course there is this idea of this idea that self-organization or polycentricity is more efficient than central planning. So this gives a first example of a big commonality between Hayek and Polanyi. So they both are against central planning, which is clear. And Polanyi uses the concept of span of control to demonstrate, to prove this better efficiency of self-organization. And he gives also some interesting diagrams that we can find in this 1969 essay, where he compares the case of what he calls corporate authority or monocentricity, where concerning this measure of span of control, you have less, he defines the span of control as the number of adjustable relations. And if you compare the two diagrams, so there is obviously a much bigger span of control in polycentricity, in the case of polycentricity, with a comparable number of actors, which is okay. How much time do we have?
35 minutes, maybe.
Okay, so I should maybe accelerate. So another point which is interesting to mention is that both authors have a similar, not completely comparable, but they have a similar theory, underlying theory of knowledge. Of course, we know about tacit knowledge in Polanyi, and his way of is focused on the problem of awareness, so focal versus subsidiary awareness. So the problem of perception is very important in the theory of knowledge, and we have some common ideas in Hayek's sensory order. So they both have a subjectivist personal theory. One is much more cognitively grounded, we would say interactionist for Hayek, while in Polanyi is more related to personnel and this is a problem of awareness. They also share a social theory which is based on the articulation between different interacting orders. So for Polanyi, society is conceived as a network of overlapping, relatively independent subcultural systems of order that preserve and cultivate certain ideas and practice. So this is the idea of embeddedness that has been put forward by Walter. So I think this is interesting also. In the case of Hayek, we can make a parallel when having in mind the division between the order and the two orders is discussing the order of rules of individual conduct and the social order of actions, which is conceived as an emergent order. There is also the similar organization when he compares the organization of the brain and the markets. So I think we could say a lot more about that, but I have no time. So to put it in a nutshell, they both have a kind of binary theoretical framework, I think. So this can be illustrated by their distinction between corporate or planning versus dynamic order supervision in Polanyi. In Hayek, you have a clear division between organization and order, or between concrete versus abstract rules, or between socialism and liberalism. So this also something which is rather inspiring. So to conclude, to come to the point of the paper. So is there a paradox? Is it possible to combine these two influences, Keynesian and Hayekian influence? So of course, some commenters do not agree with that. For instance, here you have reviewer William Stead of Full Employment and Free Trade, which states that the idea of this central, proactive state is a bit at odds with the idea of a self-organization. So, which is some argument. But we can try to offer a more synthetic view. Maybe the answer can be also linked to his career, to Polanyi's career, so that he was able to reconcile some a priori opposite views, because he was not an economist, he had no economic background. So, and later on, we had this history of economic thought, where we know that we came to the synthesis of the Keynesian idea. So maybe this is not a stupid idea. And we can also say that there are also differences between Polanyi and Hayek that can explain that there is a real contribution for giving an overall view of economics on the part of Polanyi. Clearly, they don't share the same conception of liberalism. So Polanyi has a view of liberalism and is committed to a liberal view of the state, whereas Hayek has a liberalism which is based on the notion of private freedom only, and we already talked about the distinction between private freedom and public liberty, which is very important for Polanyi. So public liberty is a kind of freedom with responsible purpose, privilege combined with duties. So that explains why he could reconcile ideas of polycentricity, but in the same time having a notion of the state that is compatible with a notion of liberalism, which is compatible with some intervention by the state. And also, they don't have Hayek and Polanyi do not have the same evolutionary theory. Hayek also provides evolutionary theory which is Lamarckian, so in the sense that also that evolution is blind, whereas for Polanyi it is clear that he brings a theological view of evolution. There is the idea of a social progress, which is and of course also moral considerations, ethical considerations, which we already emphasized a lot during this workshop. So sorry for maybe having run out of time a bit. So thank you for attention.
Questions or comments, Walt?
I'm no economist, so let me just see if I'm clear about this. The critique by Stead there talked about deficit expenditures. But that sounds like Keynes, but not like Polanyi, as I understood Polanyi. I thought Polanyi was talking about a central bank that would, where would be increased money generated that would then make it available for lower interest rate to encourage the economy indirectly that way, rather than deficit expenditures. Am I wrong about that?
I mean, the point is here just to focus on a possible contradiction in Polanyi between having
I understand,
central
but it doesn't seem like it's a very accurate description of what Klein was thinking. It's not deficit expenditures, which is then getting into the economy. Isn't making more money available?
True. I mean, it's kind of expenditures, but they do not have to be public, or they can be public and private. They are expenditure, but there must not be loans, so it's not incorrect from an economic point of view.
Yes.
Yeah.
During a slump, the offsetting, the last part of the sentence, that's correct.
Yeah.
During a slump, not
Yeah.
during a boom.
Yeah, true.
And Polanyi agreed for that.
Yes, true. Thank you.
For the comment, well,
You mentioned that Polanyi thought of himself as a Keynesian. Was that true even in the 40s, 50s, when his contact was more with Hayek? Or did Hayek think of him as a Keynesian?
Sorry, I didn't get it. Can you repeat it?
You made the comment toward the end that Polanyi thought of himself as a Keynesian. Did I misunderstand that?
Yeah, I didn't say that.
Polanyi did understand himself as the Keynesian.
Yeah. How did Hayek regard Polanyi? Did he think that Polanyi was in his camp, or?
Well,
I think there is, I mean, a clear answer is that Hayek completely gave up economics at a certain point. So he just gave up what he did on the trade cycles and this kind of macroeconomics. And then he moved to something completely different, to organization, to economic philosophy, so to his theory of knowledge. So I think in this sense, it was not an issue for him just to locate where was Polanyi as far as economics is concerned. I think their main convergence is about economic philosophy, much more than economics.
Yeah, actually, it's not true. There's a letter from Hayek to Rupke where he says Polanyi just came out as a Keynesian when he published Phenomenon and Free Trade.
Yeah,
and he writes to Rupke, and they're all trying to form this society of liberals. And Rupke said, too bad, we lost Polanyi to the Keynesian, but he's still useful on the science side.
Okay.
So we still keep him in the society because he's at the forefront of that fight, and he's really well known for that.
But way back in 37 or 38, there's that letter to Tony Stoppler where he says, I'm a Keynesian, right?
Yeah.
But he was also an Hayekian. If he was Hayekian at micro level, and he was Keynesian at the macro level.
Yeah.
So,
That.
so the way the economics works at the atomic level, it was Hayek. The way consolidated things, aggregate things go on, it was Keynesian. And by the way, that's the thought nowadays, more or less.
Yeah, but as a social theorist, it was more like Hayekian too.
Yeah. But I mean in economics, as economics.
Do you have anything on Polanyi's, how he looks at the Hayekian theory of trade cycles and business cycles? So that was a big part of the.
Yeah, I don't think I have not inquired, but I didn't think something.
Rock has been one of the reference for Polanyi to think about trade cycles. It's surprising, isn't it? But it is.
Yeah, why surprised?
Well,
yeah, because we could have thought that when he's describing trade cycles, that he could have referred also to Hayek's way of dealing with the problem. I mean, referring, for instance, to a disruption of the structure of prices or this kind of, but there is no argument of this kind at all. So I don't think he ever read Hayek on I don't know.
Because he read
Schumpeter.
He read
Yeah.
those treatises.
That's true. Yeah.
So if it doesn't appear, that means that he doesn't believe Hayek has the right interpretation of the trade side.
I really don't know. We should inquire more about that.
Just curious.
Other questions and comments? We have a bit of a little time for a general discussion. I think that's the plan here. Shall we just open it up for anything about anything on any of the papers?
Yes. It didn't give me enough time. I would like to read once more Polanyi. And go back again to Anne McCants. It is about the 5-year plan, writes in that Russia lecture, something that is quite interesting, because it was a very strong critique of the result of 5-year plan. And he was being one of the first to show that at macro level the results were meager. But anyway, he says that the period of Stalin, with its 5-year plans, has set an example of a great purpose dominating the economic life of a community. Maybe that in its efforts, these efforts were of little use. Maybe even they may have been destructive. But spiritual power does not depend on such considerations. It is strong if it gives a meaning to the life of people. And so it extracts the conclusion that we liberals, we need to recover an essence like that. Yeah.
And one thought, it's at that time when Polanyi thinks about his movie and his economic theory, in my opinion, him and other liberal economists, they're all looking for the proper analogy between the natural sciences and the scientific method there, and how to apply it to social sciences. And Polanyi tries a physical analog, and he tries to film, and a lot of the thinkers at the same time, because what they oppose is the way the Russians and socialist scientists are using the scientific method from the natural sciences to apply to the social sciences and seemingly promote planning. And they're like, we liberals need our own analogies.
A scientific proof that we don't need planning.
Yeah, we need scientific analogies that are liberal, that prove that the liberal system is actually represents both natural sciences and the social sciences.
I mean, if I could add something, it seems to me this is the problem of objectivity, right? That the scientific method claims a kind of abstract objectivity, and Polanyi recognizes that you both need that and also, in a way, can't have it, right, simultaneously. And that's the tension, right? That you want to run as much of the world as you can from that stance of objectivity. But I mean, as Michael's paper showed so nicely, that little sort of experiment of looking at recently deceased scientists, even in that field of the way we read the quality of scientific work, right? There are all of these embedded non-objective factors, right, that are going to interplay. And the power, it seems to me, that Polanyi understood of the Soviet system was that it claimed objectivity while at the same time doing it in this kind of passionate, really quasi-religious way, right? And so it played to people's desire for that embeddedness, but with this veneer of material, of abstraction, materiality is all that matters. So it's either completely sinister and brilliant, or, well, who knows, right? Or accidentally sinister. I'm not sure which, right?
Bear with me because I'm brand new to all of this, so I'm sure my questions are going to be somewhat naive. I'm hearing all this stuff about how he presented, but I haven't yet heard whether it worked. And I haven't yet heard whether people really were able to grasp onto it and where the people are in all of this. So I'm hearing things like people want protectionism as shown by Brexit and this and that. And I'm going, are they really wanting protectionism or do they want security? Are they just tired, they'll grasp at anything to get that security? And do they have, are they, like the whole thing about objectivity, I'm from a field that doesn't believe it exists, and do we want it? Or do we want mutuality and diversity as opposed to objectivity? So all of these, I have found today absolutely fascinating, and I'm going home with a new reading list that's gigantic, but I'm finding myself with so many unanswered questions that I'm just sort of putting it up there.
Well, very briefly, just one sentence, just to say that as a sort of general comment, is that I think it's quite clear from everything we've been discussing that Polanyi was a man ahead of his time at many respects. Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of integrate a few things. Polanyi is all about integration, so I thought, yes. It sounds like one way we can talk about some of the influences, some of the important ones, is to talk about Hayek as important at the micro level, economic level, Keynes at a more macro level, and Karl Polanyi at a transcendent level in terms of the values that we're seeing.
This is kind of an ignorant question. Eduardo's talked a bit about analog simulation and Polanyi's work in using analog simulation and analog computing. I'm not really sure I know quite what that is, but I am quite sure that some of the people who've paid attention to Polanyi have paid attention to the way he thinks analogically. At least that's what philosophers call it. Remember way back with the pre-Socratics, Thales says the earth is like a log floating on the ocean. And if you look at Polanyi's stuff, there are analogies everywhere. And Marjorie Green at one point analyzed personal knowledge. She said, look, this guy has talked about science as much like ordinary life and like perception. He's made a series of analogies, and that's what so annoyed analytical philosophers. And if you look even earlier at, for example, the 1941 essay, The Growth of Thought and Society, which I think some of us think is a pretty important early theoretical essay, it's an analogical discussion. Now, could you tell me the connection, Eduardo, between analogical simulation and analogical computing and what I would call analogical thinking that we see broadly manifest?
For instance, the Philips machine that I argue Polanyi made similar things. Philips machine, you can see it in Science Museum in London, for instance. And it's an apparatus with a lot of vessels and pipes, and water is flowing there. So the amount of water that flows there is more or less the amount of money that flows in the economics. In each tank, you regulate several variables, and you can make an analogy with parts of the economy. Even Philips could put one machine here and another machine there, two countries, and connect them. And so one was simulating England, and the other one was simulating France. Water was flowing. Of course, the settings in the vessels and the buffers were different. And you could have trade between both, water flowing from one to another. So this is an analog computer, in the sense that it simulates the computations, non-numerical computations of the flows in the system, and through a proxy, an alternative that is the physical flow of water. And this, the way looking at this, some people talk about hydraulic Keynesianism, and that's basically the concept is that. So instead of equations of numbers, you deal with flow of water. The nice thing was when there was a disruption in the system and everything was flooded in London School of Economics, where Phillips showed this machine. But by the way, the machine of Phillips ran around 15 years, simulating the economics of England in the Bank of England, and there was another machine in Australia, another machine in New Zealand. By the way, Phillips migrated to New Zealand, Australia, in order with a contract with the Bank of Australia to maintain the machine. And he said, yes, I go, but I want 3 days free to study Chinese. So that's the way he went. That's the contract he did. But the machine was used to calibrate the budget of each year of these countries for a lot of years.
Well, I have another comment about one of your statements, Eduardo. You talked about Mike Polanyi, as a physical chemist who was very interested in the mathematics as a scientist and everything. But in fact, Polanyi wrote somewhere in some of his letters and so forth that he wasn't really comfortable with mathematics.
Yeah.
He was more comfortable with the visual, and that's explained, for instance, also in his aesthetics. He was much more interested in visual, visual world, visual arts, than he was in mathematics or the more, you might say, abstract things. He was a visual person, so that's why I think the film really works for him.
You are right. And you are right, he said often, I'm not so good on mathematics. I would say, not true. You just see his works on chemical kinetics or things like that, and that they are or X-ray crystallography, and they are terrible dense in mathematics. Of course, he usually had good people in mathematics helping him, but he managed well the mathematical stuff. He wrote some completely forgotten papers on economics, using theory of gases, kinetic theory of gases, that is a bit Hayekian in the sense that you have the atoms, and then you can manage it by what is called statistical mechanics. And he applied exactly the equations of theory of gases for capital spending. And several papers he did things like that. So he felt, it probably was not a full mathematician, but he felt very comfortable with mathematics.
Other comments?
If nobody comments, I have a comment. Because it's a comment I made in the break with which was Eric is not here, and someone else. I don't see now. Yeah. That's about artificial intelligence, machines, and tacit knowledge. I'm not sure that tacit knowledge cannot be done by artificial intelligence, and there is emergent process for non-deterministic algorithms based on large networks, neuronal, as my son showed me yesterday, or swarms or things like that, that can create a kind of behavior that can be very similar to some aspects of tacit knowledge. So I wouldn't be so strong on the saying that tacit knowledge cannot, some aspects of tacit knowledge at least, are incompatible with machine intelligence. What Polanyi strongly argues, and I maintain, is that even under those circumstances, they will not have the conscious meaning and values of intelligence that are unique to human decision making. But not the issue probably. Polanyi argues with tacit in cybernetics, but probably, and of course, kind of technology is always completely different from what we have nowadays, or we expect to have in the future.
Here's why I disagree with Eduardo.
Yeah.
I used to be a computer programmer, and I know that computers can do nothing except what they're explicitly told to do.
No, I was a programmer at that stage also, but
And
things
so,
now are
and so in order for a machine to do anything, it has to be instructed.
algorithms are not anymore.
And it cannot be instructed in anything other than explicit truth. So by definition, the way the computer works is incompatible with tacit knowledge.
That's the classic argument of Polanyi.
So they're going to stay for another 2 hours and have this conversation. But can I just
Sure,
thank
please.
everyone for coming?
Thank you.
I actually want to thank the Polanyi Society for letting us kind of piggyback in this way and make the conversation even more broad, especially for the opportunity to bring in the graduate students whose work is really going to be in science studies and as I said, you know, in economic sociology and the new world of work and so forth, and to be able to bring them in to this, you know, deeply rooted intellectual history conversation is just fantastic. So thank you for being welcoming to some outsiders. We really appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you again. It was fun, yeah.
Conversation.
Yeah.